this week on The Perspective with Mike Sherbino, and co-hosting for Julie Stoutland is Mitch Hunter. And it's kind of Old Home Week as we welcome back to the show today Pastor Joshua Broome and journalist Billy Hollowell to talk about the supernatural. What the heck is it, and how do we define it? Well, we're going to find out from two people's perspectives. Plus, get ready for a good time with singer-songwriter J.T. Harding, whose new book, Party Like a Rock Star, is a testament to how he worked his way in life from South Detroit to writing songs with Keith Urban, and the refreshing way JT just doesn't take himself so seriously. And if it weren't for people like Nona Jones, author, entrepreneur, executive, and pastor, people like our guests today wouldn't get as recognized as they do in the all-powerful and confounding and competitive world of social media. Nora is here to talk about her work with Facebook, speaking engagements around North America, her books, and above all, balancing the delicate line between the business world and faith.
Well, we're excited today to have you join us on The Perspective. And I'm excited today to talk to Mitch because as we talk about the show today, we have Nona Jones with us, and we're going to be talking about social media. You have a Facebook account or anything like that?
I do Facebook, Mike. Some of the
Instagram? Do you do that?
Instagram is about my time. Yeah, I know there's people now, TikTok, they're a little younger than me.
I thought that had to do with my watch, but I found out it didn't.
Yeah, something like that. See, that's where you're coming from, Mike, with the social media. But I'm excited today, so I'm still working with folks in TikTok and all that, so we'll try it.
I just want someone to like me.
Mike,
how does that happen?
I want to go on record. I like you. You can record that. I like you.
Okay. Well, hey, you know what? Today, if you've ever pondered about social media, the pros, the cons, we have someone who's going to help us to unpack that a bit. She's written an amazing new book called Killing Comparisons. Would you welcome today Nona Jones to our program? Nona, thank you for coming on and being with us.
I'm so honored.
Yeah, and it's easy to brag about you and talk about you, pastor, author, and teacher, but you're also an executive at one of the largest or the largest social media platforms in the world. So we're just going to leave it at that. And I'm sure you have more people liking you than I have liking me, with whatever that means.
I hope.
That title to your book is so intriguing. And as we begin to think about killing comparisons, I have seen the damage that has happened with so many people as they start to compare themselves. Even, young people that are my age. And that's a little oxymoron, but they're going away on a holiday. Well, look what I'm doing. And all of a sudden you start to feel guilty if you haven't done that as well. So talk to me from your perspective. Why did you write the book? I can guess a few reasons, but I want to hear it from you.
Well, I think, first of all, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I wrote the book really because I probably would be considered one of the least likely people to struggle with comparison and insecurity. I mean, I've been so blessed, so fortunate in my career, in my life, married to a wonderful man, just beautiful children. And, I really thank God for his favor on my life. And yet, early in the pandemic, when, things were shutting down, I remember I had a full year of speaking engagements that year, and they all got canceled because the events got canceled. And I went on Instagram one morning just to respond to comments from people, but I caught a glimpse of my news feed, and a friend of mine made a post. She said that she was excited because she was going to be speaking at this huge virtual women's conference. And I saw her post, and I remember thinking, oh, that's cool. Well, I scrolled down a little more, and another friend announced that she was speaking at the conference. And I was like, okay. And I scrolled down a little more, and there were another friend and another friend. And it got to the point where I knew all of the speakers and I knew the host. And seeing all those posts left me with the question, why wasn't I invited? Like, why wasn't I good enough? Why didn't I measure up? And it kind of kicked off this spiral within me that led me to have to do some self-work to figure out, where was this coming from?
Wow. So Nona, that's interesting. And that's something that's not often talked about. You hear these big people who are often given public platforms like yourselves, and we never say, oh, I'm sure they go through insecurity. They're larger than life. They're on the screen, right? So just talk to us, if insecurity can come to anybody like that, What are some things we need to watch out for, and how do we process insecurity?
Well, I think it's important to know, first of all, what is insecurity? I want to start there because sometimes we think that insecurity is the result of low self esteem. And so, what we do in response is we memorize scriptures about being fearfully and wonderfully made and, being a royal priesthood. And we memorize positive affirmations about how we're good and we're smart and we're kind. And we do all these things. But insecurity is actually not about self esteem. Insecurity is a question of what is your identity secured to? And if your identity is secured to an insecure foundation, that's what leads to insecurity, which of course raises the question, well, what's an insecure foundation? An insecure foundation is really anything that is subject to other people's approval. It could be your academic credentials. Some of us have secured our identity to our financial status, our physical appearance. And so when those things don't get the approval of other people, we feel insecure. And that's what leads us to this kind of performative existence where we're posting, look at me, look at, how I'm looking in this dress, or look at this new car I bought, because it's coming out of a place of an insecure identity. And the first step to getting free from toxic comparison is figuring out what is the insecure foundation that your identity is secured to.
Well, so let me ask you another question, because so often we hear, and we're starting to see that, in my opinion, we're starting to see that on social media, and awareness that, it's unhealthy to be comparing ourselves to other people. Whatever it is in life, work at it, but don't worry about how other people feel. So we see that, the idea that, hey, we shouldn't get our approval from other people. At the same time, social media is full of that, comparisons and all this sort of thing. So how do we reconcile? Some people say, yeah, don't worry about other people. At the same time, social media, a large part of it is comparing yourself to other people. How do we reconcile that?
I love this question because, working in this space, I know that social media gets blamed all of the time for causing insecurity. And while I do believe that social media exposes insecurity, I don't believe it's the source. And the reason I don't believe it's the source is because two people can see the exact same post and have two different reactions. Let's say somebody makes a post about, their trip to Turks and Caicos, right? And they went on this amazing vacation. One person will see that post and say, wow, I want to go there. Let me see what I can do to save money so I can go to Turks and Caicos too. Another person will see that post and say, why do they get to go to Turks and Caicos? Like, that's not fair. And so it really is a question of the posture of our heart. And one of the concepts that I discuss in Killing Comparison is I talk about how comparison can actually lead to one of two outcomes. It can either lead to inspiration, which is actually the physiological process of inhaling air into your lungs. That's what it's called, is inspiration. You feel alive, invigorated. Or it can lead to expiration. And that's the physiological process of exhaling air out of your lungs. So much so that when you take your last breath, it's called your expiration date. And so whether you see somebody's success as your failure is really a question of the condition of your heart. So I don't blame social media for the condition of our heart. I really think it's an opportunity for us to ask, man, what's going on inside of me?
As you're talking about that, Nona, I was thinking back to before social media came around, and unfortunately, I can still remember those days. But we were still guilty of comparing ourselves. And as a pastor, I would compare myself to other pastors. How successful were they? And I would never want to admit it. But, pride was a huge thing as we battled it. And I think that if, as you have rightly said, that what social media has done is put the whole comparison game on steroids. It's just heightened it. And it's exposing something that we don't want to admit that is there, but it's almost like we're driven. Would you agree? It's almost like a caffeine fixation. I've got to have more, or some kind of an addiction. How have you processed that?
Yeah, I think honestly, the root of what leads to comparison has a lot to do with the words that are spoken over us. And in the book of Proverbs, it tells us that life and death are in the power of the tongue. And that word power is the Hebrew word yad, which means hand. And so when you think about it, the words that we speak actually shape, they mold, they create, they have the power to create. And so some of us are struggling with insecurity because there have been words spoken over us that have fractured our identity. They've fractured our understanding of our worth and our value. I think about the example you just gave as a pastor. Look, my husband is a pastor, and my goodness, if there was ever a place where comparison is running rampant, it's in pastors. Why? Because, that success is what gets glorified, right? Like the big mega church, that's the standard for success. Well, if your church is relatively small, you may feel like a failure, not because you really are, but because the standard of success has been set out of your reach. And so I think one of the steps that we have to take in order to deal with this compulsion to compare is we have to stop using each other as the measuring stick for our worthiness. And we have to start to really get an intimate relationship with God so that we can be like, Lord, okay, I know that the word says before I was formed in the womb that you knew me, which means I had purpose on my life before sperm met the egg. Help me to understand just how worthy I am so I stop seeing the church across the street as my competition. Yeah. Because the truth is, you're not in competition with anybody else on this earth, because when God decided that you were necessary for creation, he gave you a unique purpose that nobody else can fill.
Nona, those are powerful words, and we're going to come back and pick it up after a short break. You're watching The Perspective today, and our guest is Nona Jones. We'll be right back. Well, we're back right now with Nona Jones, and she's an executive at the largest social media platform in the world. Along with that, she's an author, a teacher, pastor, you name it. And seems like she has just about done it. And what would you do if you had to compare yourself to Nona? Well, Nona, give us some advice. Why, you were just talking about that, why we need to be secure in who we are. I can't compare myself to you, but tell me why.
Well, I want to go a little bit deeper. So I mentioned before the break, Jeremiah chapter 1 and 5. And I think we often read that verse with a level of familiarity that actually lessens its poignancy. So if you read it slowly, it says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. What that means there, if you really slow down, is that, again, not life began at conception. You actually had an identity before conception. And so many of us, we're being born an original, but we're dying a duplicate, because throughout our life, we're seeing other people as our competitors. We're seeing other people as the benchmark for success. And I think what it's doing is it's making many of us actually shrink our purpose down, so that we're fitting inside of the small box of other people's opinions of us. I do believe that what God intends for every single one of us is so powerful, it's so purposeful, that he decided we were necessary for creation. God doesn't make extras and he doesn't make duplicates. And so for me, I think the reason why we have to understand that is that the cemetery is the richest place on earth, because many of us are actually dying with incredible amounts of potential on the inside of us that's never been realized because of comparison.
So Nona, let's press into that. You're saying we don't want to make other people the benchmark. So help me to understand, what is the benchmark for myself, for viewers at home who are saying, yeah, you know what, I do struggle with comparison. I don't want to look at other people. I'm created by God. And as you're saying, God creates everybody unique. How do I enjoy that uniqueness that God has given to me? And how do I live in a way that grabs onto that and steps into that uniqueness?
So throughout the book, throughout Killing Comparison, there is a thread of a story, a Bible story. And I want to just give it a little bit of airtime now, because I think it answers your question. So Most people know about the dysfunctional relationship between King Saul and David, right? Like we know King Saul was jealous of David because David, he got the approval of the people. Now, David started off as, just this like young shepherd boy who killed Goliath. Saul enlisted him in his army, and David became a mighty warrior, so much so that one time King Saul and David were returning to town, and the people were singing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And it was in that moment that the Bible says that Saul actually became jealous of David. Now, the reason why I bring this up is there's actually a third person in that story who doesn't get talked about enough. And his name is Jonathan. He's Saul's son. Many people know that Jonathan was David's best friend, but what you don't know is if you go over to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 31, whereas we've been told the headline of that story is the dysfunction between Saul and David, that Saul saw David as a threat to his kingdom. Saul says to Jonathan was defending David because Saul wanted to kill him. Saul says to Jonathan, do you not know that as long as David lives, neither you nor your kingdom will be established? In other words, Saul was telling Jonathan, David's not a threat to me. He's a threat to you. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because if you know Jonathan, and I really encourage you to study Jonathan, way back when he's first introduced to us, 1 Samuel chapter 14 and 6, he makes an interesting statement. He goes to fight a group of Philistines by himself. And he said, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. I believe that is the fundamental truth that we have to secure our identity to. You are not in competition with anybody else, because as long as God is for you, no one can oppose you. And if you understand that, you will never see the need for comparison ever again.
If I could add my 2 cents into that, it's something we have to work at continually, because just when I feel I've got it whipped, it sneaks back up and it bites me. And I'll just confess, I really had to struggle for a period of a couple years with a person that I had once hired who went out on his own and was far more successful, at least as the world looked at, than I ever was. And that was a hard one. And I finally had to put him on my prayer list to pray for blessing on his life. And it was hard for me to pray sincerely, but then there was a breakthrough. And that was an interesting place where I could rejoice in what he was doing and be excited. I would love for you just to take a few minutes and talk to our viewers about what are some of the safeguards we can put into place with social media. I mean, at different times we've heard different things, but love to hear it from you. What do we need to put into place, especially so that we guard our heart?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, and I talk about this in the book, we have to guard our eyes in order to guard our heart. Sometimes insecurity is triggered because the things that we're keeping before our eyes are communicating to us that we're not good enough, that we don't measure up, that we're somehow deficient, we've somehow been left out, we've been overlooked. And so I think one of the tools that we can use, which I think everybody should use liberally, is unfollow. If there's someone that you're following and every time they're making a post about how perfect their family is, how perfect their life is, which, let's be real, perfection is fiction. There's no such thing as perfection. But you start to feel like, man, my marriage sucks because theirs is amazing. Or wow, my career is horrible because theirs is thriving. Unfollow. You can even mute them, which means you don't unfollow them, but you don't see their posts. Guard your eyes to guard your heart. And I would also say do that in real life. Sometimes in real life, there are people that you don't need to spend a lot of time with because they're constantly talking about the highlight reel of their life. And it just makes you feel worse and worse about yours.
Well, that's good. So, Mitch, you need to unfollow me. That's be one of my takeaways.
I'll put you on mute. You'll think I'm following you. You'll be muted.
And defriend me or whatever it is. So, Nona, it's just been a privilege chatting with you today. And Killing Comparisons can be found at Amazon.com. And why do people need to read it? Tell us that from your perspective.
Yeah, I think many of us have believed so many lies about our worthiness. And listen, I've read a lot of great books about insecurity. I've read really good books written by really thoughtful authors. But you know what? I didn't experience freedom. And that's why I wrote my book, because there is a roadmap to get free for real from comparison-born insecurity. So if you're struggling with this, if you're wrestling with this, this is an area of life where you want to get victory, killing comparison will provide that to you so you can live confident in who God has created you to be.
Great summary. Nona Jones, thank you so much for being with us. We encourage you to get her book, Killing Comparisons. You can find it at your local bookstore or on Amazon.com.
So everything that happened to you, everything in your background, God can use for his glory. There is nothing that you have experienced, there is nothing that you have done that God cannot use. And we spend so much time covering it out of shame. But shame is a tool of the enemy to get you to dumb down your purpose, your trauma, your shame, your guilt. All of those things are not your burden, they are your ministry. They are your ministry. But we despise our roots. I know people right now that I know their history, but they would never share it with you because they feel ashamed of it. And I realize, I'm speaking to young people for a moment. Young people can be so mean.
Well, you know, I love the way that Nona Jones just kind of speaks truth. She just calls it out for what it is, especially in this whole area of social media that everyone seems to understand, but then everyone doesn't seem to understand the implications of it. Mitch, I know there was a couple takeaways that stuck in your mind. Share those with us.
Sure, yeah, probably the biggest one, Mike, the easiest thing to just grab onto and go home with is when Nona said, to guard your heart, you've got to guard your eyes. And I just think that's so applicable to everyday life, that the sorts of things that we choose to give our attention to and to focus our eyes on, those are the sorts of things that are speaking into our heart and are shaping the way that we think. And so if we go and we look at all these other people that we compare ourselves to, or we look at things that we shouldn't be looking at, or whatever the case may be, those are going to affect our heart. And so I got to say, you know what? Am I going to choose to fix my eyes on Jesus today? And I think that's the biggest takeaway for me.
That's a huge focus. And, you know, earlier this week, I was reading in the book of Corinthians, and it had an interesting phrase that said, we need to take every thought captive. And what does that mean? It means I need to bring it before God, before his grid, and say, does this really count? Does this really matter? And if I could just talk to you as the viewer today, it is so easy to be caught up with social media. It's so easy to get caught up in the comparison game. And you need to kill those comparisons because your worth, your value is found in who you are in God. And discover that God has created each of us for a distinct purpose. And what God calls Mitch to do, he hasn't called me, or vice versa. Think about that. Well, today we want to conclude our teaching on the long wait of disappointment. And as we are looking at the life of Moses, we see that Moses had to wait. And I think that there was a point he gave up waiting. He probably despaired. 40 years in the wilderness. Moses' life is marked by 3 periods of 40. 40 in the courts of Pharaoh, when he was taken as a baby out of the bulrushes. 40 in the wilderness, and then 40 as he's leading the nation of Israel. Now, hopefully you and I don't have to wait 40 years to see an answer to our prayers. But the Israelites had actually been waiting 400 years. But only as they got near the end did they cry out and say, God, would you set us free? They had become quite comfortable in the situation they were in. And now God allowed hardship to be able to stir them to say, hey, you know, we need to leave here. In the early church, we see in the book of Acts that the church experienced persecution. And as a result, the persecution caused them to move out. I asked you a question a few days ago. Is God allowing something in your life to prepare you for a move? What could that be? What is it? Well, one of the things I do know is that there's a reality check that we go through as we are waiting. Stuff happens. Moses is in the wilderness. He has run for his life from Pharaoh. He's probably given up all hope of ever being the leader. But what is happening? Well, we read back in Exodus chapter 2 that the Israelites are groaning because of their enslavement. Moses isn't aware of that. That's the upper story that is taking place. What happens in Moses' life? Well, he starts to adjust. He gets married. The other thing he does is that he becomes a shepherd. He's probably glad that nobody in Egypt knew what he was doing because they'd laugh at him. The Egyptians despise shepherds. It was the lowest of the lowest class. How interesting that Jesus himself is referred to as the great shepherd. We see that many of the men who shaped the life of Israel, including King David, they were shepherds. And the message of the birth of Christ came to, guess who? Came to shepherds. What was God teaching Moses through all of this? I believe he was teaching him humility. He was teaching him meekness, because we read later on that after he'd gone through this period, Moses was the meekest man on the earth. And meekness is not weakness, it is rather power under control. But life goes on while you're waiting. And as we begin to think about that, what do we need to know while we're waiting? We get an insight in Exodus 2 and verse 23. I want to read it to you because your situation today is critical. You are overwhelmed. Maybe you're waiting for something. I know what it's like to wait. I know what it's like to be disappointed. But here is a great reminder. It says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. That's the first thing. God is aware. He hears your groaning. God remembered his covenant, his promises to be your refuge and strength. He remembers those things. And God saw the people of Israel, and God understood. He sees you, he sees me, and he understands. You know, this becomes a pivotal point in the life of Moses. As he's going through this period in the wilderness, he doesn't realize that God is about to change the elevator. The elevator had to take him down. His pride was humbled. And now 40 years later, he's at a point where the elevator can go up. We know the story of the burning bush, how Moses is out taking care of the sheep. It's just a regular day. He's looking for pasture. But in the midst of that regular day, God saw that his heart was ready. And God knows his perfect timing for you and for me, regardless of how long the wait might be. And he uses a burning bush to get Moses' attention. The bush can speak to so many different things, but I think the main takeaway today, and I do believe it was a burning bush, I believe in the supernatural power of God, but the bush caught Moses' attention. And I'd like to ask you today, what is God using to catch your attention so the elevator can start to go up, so that you can walk in your kingdom potential? Is it a situation you're dealing with? Is it a sickness? I've gone through that recently, and God got my attention. Could it be a sadness? Or what is the long wait of disappointment? Here's what I want you to know, that God wants to meet you right here, right now. And he says to Moses, take off your sandals. This is holy ground. What you're going through right now that God is using to catch your attention is his holy ground. And he wants to reveal himself in the midst of your burning bush experience. Will you remember this? God's timing is perfect. I know you're frustrated. I know you can be disappointed. But remember this, God is never in a rush, but he is never late. And he wants to be your present help in time of trouble today. You can trust him. You can rest in him because he is your Savior and your Lord.